The boy had his father's eyes, and that was the problem. Snow drifted lazily across the valley as a small child stood alone beside a frozen stream, his boots sinking slightly into the fresh white powder. He could not have been older than 4. A worn wool coat hung loosely around his tiny frame, and a knitted scarf nearly swallowed his chin. Yet anyone who looked closely forgot the scarf, forgot the coat, forgot the snow, because of his eyes. Bright silver, impossible silver, the kind of eyes that appeared only once in a generation, the kind carried by the royal bloodline of Blackwood kings. The little boy crouched beside the ice-covered water and traced patterns across the frost with a gloved finger. A faint smile touched his face when he saw his reflection staring back at him. Behind him, smoke curled from the chimney of a small wooden cabin tucked between towering pine trees. The cabin was simple, weathered, hidden far from the roads used by merchants and travelers. It was the sort of place people passed without noticing, which was exactly why Claire Hartwell had chosen it. The cabin door opened, and warm golden light spilled into the cold afternoon. Claire stepped outside carrying a basket of firewood. For a moment, she simply watched the boy, her son, the center of her entire world. The sight of him always softened something inside her chest. For years had passed since the day everything had been taken from her. For years since she had been forced to leave the only home she had ever known. For years since an alpha king she trusted had looked at her and chosen judgment over faith. Time had healed some wounds. Not all of them. "Oliver," she called gently. "Dinner will be ready soon." The boy looked up immediately. His silver eyes brightened. "Can I stay outside 5 more minutes?" Claire tried not to smile. "You said that 10 minutes ago." Oliver grinned and held up both hands. "Then just 5 more." She laughed softly despite herself. 5 minutes. The boy cheered and returned to his frozen kingdom beside the stream. Claire turned back toward the cabin, but her smile faded as her gaze lingered on him. Every year it became harder to ignore the resemblance. The same silver eyes, the same dark hair, the same stubborn tilt of the chin. Some days it felt as though she was looking at a smaller version of the man she had spent 4 years trying to forget. A cold wind swept through the trees. Claire pulled her coat tighter and glanced toward the distant mountains visible beyond the forest. Somewhere beyond those peaks stood the kingdom she left behind. Somewhere beyond them sat Alpha King Ethan Blackwood. She wondered if he ever thought about the past. Then she pushed the thought away. It no longer mattered. Her life was here now, with Oliver. Safe, quiet, hidden, but hundreds of miles away, inside a grand stone castle overlooking an entire kingdom. A sleepless king stood alone before a fireplace, staring at an old portrait of a woman he had never truly forgotten. And neither of them knew that fate had already begun moving them toward each other once again. For 4 years, Alpha King Ethan Blackwood had learned a cruel truth about regret. It never truly slept. It waited, patiently, quietly. It sat beside him during council meetings, followed him through crowded halls, stood behind him during ceremonies and celebrations. And every night, when the castle finally grew silent, regret returned to the same place. The fireplace in his private study. The room was dark except for the glow of burning logs. Shadows danced across shelves lined with maps, treaties, and royal records. Ethan stood alone near the mantel, one hand resting against the polished stone. He had dismissed his advisors hours ago. The guards remained outside the chamber doors. No one disturbed him at this hour anymore. They all knew where he would be. His gaze settled on a framed portrait resting above the fireplace. Claire Hartwell. The artist had captured her exactly as she had been years ago. Soft brown hair illuminated by sunlight. Clear blue eyes filled with quiet determination. A smile that never sought attention, yet somehow drew it anyway. Ethan stared at the portrait longer than he intended, just as he did every night. A faint ache settled in his chest. Time should have erased it by now. It had not. The fire crackled softly. Snow tapped against the tall windows overlooking the kingdom. Beyond those walls stretched thousands of square miles under his protection. Villages, forests, rivers, mountains. An entire realm depended on him. Yet none of that mattered during moments like this. Because no matter how powerful he became, he could not change the past. He remembered the day everything ended. The accusations, the evidence presented before him, the angry voices demanding justice. Claire standing alone in the center of the great hall. He remembered the disappointment in her eyes more clearly than anything else. Not fear. Not anger. Disappointment. As though she had expected him to know better. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. The memory remained sharp despite the years. A knock sounded at the study door. He straightened immediately. Enter. The door opened, and Beta Commander Lucas Mercer stepped inside. One of the few people Ethan trusted completely. Lucas hesitated before speaking. Your Majesty, you should get some rest. Ethan almost laughed. Rest. The word felt foreign. I will. Lucas glanced toward the portrait. His expression softened slightly. You said that yesterday. Silence settled between them. Finally, Lucas stepped closer. It has been 4 years. Ethan's jaw tightened. I am aware. Lucas nodded slowly. Then perhaps it is time to let the past go. Ethan looked back toward the portrait. The firelight reflected softly across Claire's painted face. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he answered quietly. If she had truly been guilty, I could have. Lucas did not respond. There was nothing to say, because they both understood the meaning behind those words. Ethan had spent 4 years convincing the kingdom that his decision had been necessary. Yet, deep inside, a single question never stopped haunting him. What if he had been wrong? Outside, the snow continued falling across the kingdom. Hundreds of miles away, Claire tucked her son into bed beside a small fireplace. Neither of them knew that fate had already begun unraveling secrets long buried beneath the weight of 4 silent years. The memory returned the same way it always did. Without warning, Claire could be chopping firewood, hanging laundry, or stirring soup over the fireplace when suddenly she would find herself standing in that great hall again. For years disappeared in an instant. The warmth of her cabin vanished. The sound of Oliver laughing faded away. And she was once more a young Omega standing alone beneath towering stone arches while an entire kingdom judged her. The hall had been crowded that day. Nobles filled the balconies. Warriors lined the walls. Advisors stood in small groups whispering among themselves. Their voices blended into a restless hum that echoed across the chamber like distant thunder. Claire remembered every face. More importantly, she remembered how none of them would meet her eyes. Not even the people she once called friends. She stood at the center of the room, wearing a pale blue dress she had chosen that morning because Ethan liked the color. The thought seemed almost cruel now. At the far end of the hall sat Alpha King Ethan Blackwood upon the throne of Blackwood Kings. He looked exactly as he always had. Strong, confident, untouchable. Yet something in his expression felt different that day. Colder, more distant. Between them stood a council member reading accusations from a parchment scroll. The words blurred together in Claire's memory. Betrayal, conspiracy, treason, secrets, lies. She remembered hearing them. She remembered understanding them. But she never truly understood why they were being spoken about her. Every piece of evidence presented against her seemed impossible. Letters she had never written. Meetings she had never attended. Witnesses claiming things she had never done. The more she listened, the more unreal everything felt. Several times she tried to speak. Several times she attempted to explain. Yet every explanation seemed to disappear beneath another accusation. Another claim. Another voice demanding punishment. Through it all, Claire kept looking toward Ethan. Waiting. Hoping. Believing he would stop it. Because if anyone knew her heart, it was him. Or so she thought. Finally, the accusations ended. Silence settled over the hall. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the throne. Claire remembered the pounding of her heartbeat. She remembered the way her hands trembled. Most of all, she remembered Ethan rising to his feet. The room became completely still. Claire Hartwell, he said. His voice echoed through the chamber. She had heard that voice speak her name with kindness before. She had heard it softened by affection. That day, however, it sounded like a stranger's voice. The evidence presented before this court leaves no room for doubt. Claire felt the floor vanish beneath her. She stared at him, waiting for the correction, waiting for the moment he would say there had been a mistake. It never came. The disappointment she felt then stayed with her long after the exile itself. Because in that moment, before any punishment was announced, before any sentence was spoken, Claire realized something far more painful. Ethan believed she was guilty. Back in the present, Claire sat quietly beside the cabin fireplace while snow drifted beyond the windows. Oliver slept peacefully in the next room. She stared into the flames and closed her eyes. For years later, the memory still hurt. Not because she lost her home. Not because she lost her title. but because the man she trusted most had been the first person to stop believing in her. The exile had ended 3 days earlier when Claire finally allowed herself to stop walking. Snow covered the ground in every direction, stretching across hills and forests that felt endless beneath the pale winter sky. Her legs ached. Her shoulders burned from carrying the small bag that contained everything she still owned. By then, the shock had begun to fade, leaving exhaustion in its place. She found an abandoned hunting cabin deep within the northern woods and decided it would be enough. Enough for one person, at least. The roof leaked slightly near the chimney. The windows rattled whenever the wind grew strong. The furniture consisted of little more than a narrow bed, a table, and 2 chairs. Yet for someone who had lost everything, it felt strangely comforting. Nobody knew where she was. Nobody could judge her. Nobody could look at her with pity. During the first week, Claire focused only on survival. She gathered firewood, trapped rabbits, collected water from a nearby stream. Each day blended into the next. She tried not to think about the kingdom she had left behind. She tried even harder not to think about Ethan. Some mornings she succeeded. Most mornings she failed. Then came the day everything changed. It started with dizziness. Claire nearly dropped a bucket while returning from the stream. The world tilted unexpectedly. She steadied herself against a tree and waited for the feeling to pass. Later that afternoon, the smell of cooking stew made her stomach turn. The reaction surprised her. By evening, a strange suspicion had already begun forming in the back of her mind. 2 weeks later, the village healer from a settlement 20 miles away confirmed what her heart had secretly known. Claire sat silently across from the elderly woman while a small fire crackled nearby. Outside, snow drifted gently across the windows. Inside, time seemed to stop. "You are expecting a child?" the healer said softly. The words settled over the room like falling snow. Claire stared at her hands. For several seconds, she could not breathe. A child. Her child. Ethan's child. Emotion rushed through her all at once. Shock, fear, joy, grief, hope. The feelings tangled together until she could no longer separate one from another. The healer continued speaking, offering practical advice about food, rest, and care, but Claire barely heard any of it. Her thoughts remained fixed on a single truth. She was not alone anymore. That night she sat beside the cabin fireplace long after the flames burned low. One hand rested gently against her stomach. Tears filled her eyes, though she could not have explained whether they came from happiness or heartbreak. Perhaps both. She thought about Ethan then. Not the Alpha King. Not the ruler who had condemned her. The man she once loved. For one brief moment, she imagined telling him. Imagined his reaction. Imagined him placing a hand against her stomach and smiling. The fantasy lasted only seconds before reality returned. Ethan believed she had betrayed him. The kingdom believed she was guilty. Her child deserved better than a life built upon rejection and doubt. Claire wiped away her tears and stared into the fading fire. In that moment, a decision quietly formed inside her heart. She would protect this child no matter what, even if she had to do it alone. Especially if she had to do it alone. The years passed quietly in the northern wilderness, measured not by calendars, but by seasons. Winter storms gave way to spring rains. Spring melted into warm summers filled with wildflowers and long evenings. Then autumn painted the forests gold before snow returned once more. Through it all, Claire built a life from almost nothing. It was not the life she once imagined. It was smaller, simpler, yet in ways she never expected, it became stronger too. Every morning began before sunrise. She chopped firewood, tended a small vegetable garden, repaired fences, and traded handmade goods with nearby villagers. Life demanded constant effort. There were days when exhaustion settled deep into her bones. Days when supplies ran low. Days when storms trapped them inside for hours. Yet every challenge seemed easier once Oliver arrived. The moment she first held him, the loneliness that had followed her into exile began to fade. His tiny hand wrapped around her finger. His silver eyes blinked open for the first time. And suddenly the future no longer felt frightening. It felt necessary. Oliver grew quickly. Too quickly sometimes. At 4 years old, he possessed endless curiosity and enough energy to fill the entire valley. He asked questions about everything. Why birds migrated. Why snow sparkled. Why the moon seemed larger during winter. Claire answered as many as she could. The questions she struggled with were different. The questions about fathers. Those questions always arrived unexpectedly. One evening, after helping her gather firewood, Oliver sat beside the fireplace while snow tapped gently against the windows. He stared into the flames for several minutes before speaking. "Mama." Claire looked up from the blanket she was sewing. "Yes." Oliver tilted his head. "Did I ever have a father?" The needle paused in her hand. The room suddenly felt smaller. For a moment, only the crackling fire filled the silence. Oliver waited patiently. Claire forced a small smile. "Of course you have a father." The boy's eyes brightened immediately. "Where is he?" The question struck harder than she expected. Claire looked toward the fire. Countless answers passed through her mind. None felt right. Finally, she spoke softly. "Far away." Oliver considered that. "Does he know about me?" Claire lowered her gaze. The answer was no. Ethan had never known. Not about the pregnancy. Not about Oliver. Not about any of it. Yet saying the word aloud felt impossible. "I do not know," she admitted. Oliver accepted the answer more easily than she did. Children often did. Moments later, he was smiling again, distracted by a new question about wolves and winter tracks. But Claire remained quiet long after he went to bed. That night, she stood outside beneath a sky filled with stars. Cold air brushed against her face. The forest stretched endlessly around her. Somewhere beyond those mountains sat the kingdom she left behind. Somewhere beyond them lived a man who shared the same silver eyes as her son. For years ago, Claire believed distance could bury the past. Standing beneath the stars, she finally realized something unsettling. The past had never truly disappeared. It had simply been waiting. And far away inside Blackwood Castle, a forgotten truth was preparing to find its way home. The truth began its journey back to the kingdom on an ordinary winter afternoon. Claire was trading jars of honey and hand-sewn blankets at a small market town nearly 30 miles from the cabin. The village square bustled with activity despite the cold. Merchants called out prices. Children ran between stalls. Travelers warmed their hands beside outdoor fire pits while horses stamped impatiently in the snow. For Claire, it was a routine trip. For Fate, it was something else entirely. Oliver walked beside her carrying a small basket almost as large as his torso. He took his responsibility very seriously. Every few steps, he checked the contents to make sure nothing had fallen out. Claire smiled each time she noticed. The boy's determination reminded her of someone she tried not to think about. They stopped beside a bakery where warm bread filled the air with a comforting smell. While Claire spoke with the owner, Oliver wandered a few feet away to watch a group of travelers unloading supplies from a wagon. Among them stood an older merchant named Samuel Pierce. He had spent more than 20 years traveling between distant territories and royal cities. Very little surprised him anymore. Then he looked up and saw the child. Samuel froze. The loaf of bread in his hand nearly slipped to the ground. Across the square, Oliver laughed at something one of the wagon drivers said. Sunlight reflected in his silver eyes. The merchant stared. Those eyes. He had seen them before. Not once. Hundreds of times. On coins. Portraits. Royal banners. The resemblance struck him with such force that he momentarily forgot where he was. A young boy with the unmistakable eyes of Blackwood royalty stood less than 20 feet away. Samuel watched carefully as Claire called the child back to her side. The moment he saw them together, questions began forming in his mind. Questions that refused to leave. Later that evening, after the market closed, Samuel sat alone in his room at the village inn. Snow tapped against the window. A candle flickered beside his travel journal. He thought about the boy again. The silver eyes. The dark hair. The age. Then another memory surfaced. A face he had not seen in years. Claire Hartwell. The former Omega exiled from the kingdom. Samuel sat upright. Suddenly, everything fit together too well. Far away in Blackwood Castle, Ethan spent the evening reviewing trade reports with his council. The meeting dragged on for hours. Numbers blurred together. Discussions repeated themselves. None of it held his attention. Lately, an unshakable restlessness followed him everywhere, as though something important waited just beyond his reach. He could not explain it. Shortly before midnight, a royal messenger entered the council chamber carrying a stack of correspondence gathered from neighboring territories. Ethan barely glanced at the letters. Just another collection of routine reports. Yet among them rested a message sealed by a merchant guild from the northern frontier. A message that would arrive on his desk before sunrise. A message containing observations from a traveling merchant who believed he had seen something impossible. Outside, snow continued falling across the kingdom. In a quiet cabin hidden among the northern forests, Oliver slept peacefully beside the fireplace while Claire finished mending one of his winter coats. Neither of them knew that a single conversation in a marketplace had just begun unraveling 4 years of carefully guarded secrets. The letter arrived just after sunrise. Ethan barely noticed it at first. A stack of correspondence already waited on his desk when he entered the royal study. Trade agreements, border reports, harvest projections, requests from neighboring territories. The usual responsibilities of a king. He settled into his chair and began reviewing them one by one. Outside the tall windows, snow drifted across the castle grounds. Inside, the fire crackled quietly beneath the stone mantel. Everything felt ordinary, until he reached the merchant's report. Ethan almost set it aside. The seal belonged to a minor trade guild operating near the northern frontier. Normally, such reports never reached him directly. Something about the attached note, however, caught his attention. A personal observation from a veteran merchant. Ethan unfolded the parchment and began reading. At first, the contents seemed insignificant. The merchant described a market town, winter conditions, and routine trading activity. Then one sentence made Ethan stop. He read it again. Then a third time. The report described a young boy, approximately 4 years old. Dark hair, silver eyes. Ethan stared at the words. A strange tension settled in his chest. Silver eyes. The Blackwood bloodline was known throughout the kingdom for that trait. Rare, distinctive, impossible to mistake. He continued reading. The merchant claimed the child strongly resembled the royal family. More importantly, he believed the boy was living with Claire Hartwell. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Ethan lowered the parchment slowly. For several moments, he simply stared at the fire. Claire Hartwell, a name he had spent 4 years trying unsuccessfully to forget. The report remained on his desk. Rationally, he knew there could be explanations. Coincidences existed. Similar appearances happened. Yet something deep inside refused to dismiss it. He reached for the parchment again. This time he read every word carefully. Hours later, Ethan stood inside the royal archives. Dust floated through shafts of winter sunlight as librarians and historians searched through old records. Beta Commander Lucas watched from nearby with growing concern. You cannot seriously believe a merchant's rumor. Ethan did not answer immediately. His attention remained fixed on a stack of documents spread across a large oak table. Travel records, exile orders, dates, timelines. Every detail connected to Claire's departure. Finally, he looked up. How long after the exile did she disappear completely? Lucas frowned. Several weeks. Ethan's stomach tightened. Several weeks. The possibility he had been avoiding suddenly became impossible to ignore. He calculated dates again, then again, each time arriving at the same conclusion. For years ago, Claire vanished shortly after leaving the kingdom. For years ago, she had severed every connection. For years ago, she had disappeared at exactly the same moment someone might have discovered they were carrying a child. Ethan stepped back from the table. A cold wave of realization swept through him. Not certainty. Not yet. But enough to make his heart race. Across the kingdom, Claire spent the afternoon teaching Oliver how to identify animal tracks in fresh snow. The boy listened carefully, occasionally asking questions that made her smile. It felt like any other day. Peaceful. Familiar. Safe. Yet somewhere far away, a single letter had already changed everything. For the first time in 4 years, Ethan Blackwood was no longer haunted only by the possibility that Claire had been innocent. Now another thought had begun following him. A far more terrifying thought. What if he had lost far more than Claire that day? 3 days later, Ethan could no longer remain inside the castle. The unanswered questions had grown too heavy. Every report he reviewed, every meeting he attended, every conversation he held eventually led him back to the same thought. Claire. The possibility of a child. The possibility that everything he believed 4 years ago had been wrong. Winter sunlight poured through the palace windows as he stood before a large map spread across the council table. Several locations had been marked in ink. Market towns, trade routes, villages along the northern frontier. Lucas watched him quietly from across the room. You are really going? Ethan nodded without hesitation. I should have gone years ago. The admission hung in the air between them. Neither man spoke for a moment. There was no argument Lucas could make. The truth was simple. Ethan had spent 4 years ruling a kingdom while avoiding the one question that mattered most. Now that question had finally found him. Preparations began immediately. Advisors protested. Council members argued that a king should not travel without ceremony or escort. Ethan ignored them. This journey was not about politics. It was not about appearances. For the first time in years, he wanted something more than power, more than control, more than certainty. He wanted the truth. Hundreds of miles away, Claire's day began like every other. She woke before sunrise and lit the fireplace while Oliver still slept beneath a pile of blankets. The cabin felt warm and peaceful. Outside, snow rested across the valley like a white blanket stretching toward the horizon. For a few precious hours, life remained simple. After breakfast, Oliver insisted on helping gather kindling from the edge of the forest. Claire watched him race through the snow with endless enthusiasm. He laughed whenever he discovered animal tracks. He asked questions about every bird that crossed the sky. Sometimes she forgot how much he was growing. Then moments like this reminded her. He was no longer a baby. He was becoming his own person. As the afternoon sun drifted lower, Oliver stopped beside a frozen stream and stared at his reflection. "Mama." Claire looked up from the bundle of branches she carried. "Yes." The boy tilted his head thoughtfully. "Do you think I look like my father?" The question caught her completely off guard. For a second, she could not answer. Oliver continued studying the ice. "People keep saying I have unusual eyes." Claire's chest tightened. She walked over and knelt beside him. The silver eyes looking back at her were impossible to ignore. For years had not changed that. If anything, the resemblance had become stronger. She brushed a strand of dark hair away from his forehead. "You have your own eyes," she said softly. Oliver smiled. "But do I look like him?" Claire hesitated. Then she answered honestly. "Yes." The boy seemed pleased by that. He returned his attention to the frozen stream, completely unaware of the emotions swirling through her heart. That evening, after Oliver fell asleep, Claire stood alone outside the cabin. The stars glittered above the forest. A cold breeze moved through the trees. For reasons she could not explain, an uneasy feeling settled over her. It was not fear exactly, more like anticipation, as though something long delayed was finally approaching. Far to the south, beneath the same winter sky, Ethan Blackwood rode north through falling snow with only a handful of trusted companions. For the first time in 4 years, the distance between them was growing smaller. The cabin appeared just before sunset. Ethan reined in his horse at the edge of a snow-covered ridge and stared through the falling flakes below. Nestled among towering pines stood a small wooden home with smoke rising from its chimney. Simple, quiet, hidden from the world. For a long moment, he could not move. For years of questions, regret, and sleepless nights suddenly narrowed into a single point on the landscape. Somewhere inside that cabin was the woman he had never forgotten. Perhaps the child as well. His heart pounded harder than it ever had during battles, negotiations, or royal ceremonies. Lucas guided his horse beside him but remained silent. Some moments required no words. Ethan dismounted and continued the rest of the distance on foot. Snow crunched beneath his boots. Each step felt heavier than the last. Down below, Claire was hanging freshly washed blankets near the cabin while Oliver chased a rabbit trail through the snow. The peaceful routine of the afternoon had almost convinced her that the strange feeling from the night before meant nothing. Then Oliver suddenly stopped running. He looked toward the trees. "Mama," he called. Claire turned. At first she saw only shadows between the pines. Then a tall figure stepped into the fading winter light. Everything inside her froze. The world seemed to fall silent. No wind. No birds. No sound except the rapid beating of her own heart. Ethan Blackwood stood less than 50 feet away, older than she remembered, more tired, more human somehow, yet unmistakably him. Neither moved. For years of distance stretched between them. Memories she had spent years trying to bury rushed back all at once. The Great Hall, the accusations, the exile, the heartbreak. Claire tightened her grip on the blanket in her hands. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came. Every speech he had imagined during the journey vanished the instant he saw her. Because no apology seemed large enough. No explanation seemed sufficient. Then movement beside Claire drew his attention. A small boy stepped forward from behind her. Dark hair, winter coat, curious expression, silver eyes. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. The child looked directly at him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Oliver glanced up at Claire. "Mama." His small voice carried through the stillness. Claire swallowed hard. Her eyes never left Ethan. The boy followed her gaze back to the stranger standing in the snow. Something about the man seemed familiar, though he could not understand why. Ethan stared at the child. The resemblance was undeniable. Not because of the silver eyes alone. It was the shape of his face, the stubborn set of his jaw, the way he stood. Pieces of himself reflected back at him in a boy he had never known existed. Emotion tightened painfully in his chest. For years lost forever. Oliver took a cautious step forward. "Do I know you?" The question nearly broke him. Ethan's eyes filled with emotion he no longer cared to hide. He looked at Claire first, then at the child standing between them. Finally, he answered with complete honesty. "No." His voice was quiet. "But I think I should have." Claire's breath caught. The last rays of sunlight spilled across the snow as silence settled once more between them. And standing there with her son between them, she realized the future she had spent 4 years avoiding had finally arrived.